Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Such a nice crowd. That was really, okay, let's do it again. Hi, everyone. Hi. I'm not going to ask you to do a wave. Or unless you want to. You really want to? That's a spirit. Okay. Okay, points. Person who did the wave also brought flowers, so double hand of a round of applause for this. Welcome to our third night of faculty events this week, the 6th week of summer workshops. We have 3 more weeks of summer workshops after this, during which we will have 3 events a week. So if you're around here for longer than this week, be sure to stop by Mondays, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays at 5 o'clock for some spectacular faculty talks. Am I not right? Have they not been really awesome this week? They've been just like really big hand for the faculty this week, really stellar. And it's going to be stellar tonight too, because we're going to hear from writer Doug Bauer. Where did I see him? There he is, right there. And visual artist Megan Hinton. Big hand for Megan. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. I can't speak anymore because Wednesdays. Doug will be signing books at the back of the room after the event, and books will be for sale at the back of the store, back of the common room, all the faculty that we have here this week. And as always, we have books by other faculty and former fellows and other people associated with the Work Center in our book center between the 2 halves of the gallery next door to your right. In the gallery, we have a wonderful show, summer exhibition called Edge Condition, curated by former Falk Fellow Matt Bollinger. And it consists of work by 20 or so former Falk Fellows. It's really wonderful work. I'd encourage you to check it out. It'll be open after the event and will be open from 12 to 5 between now and Saturdays, from Tuesdays to Saturdays. Let's see, what else? A big shout out to East End Books for helping manage our bookstore in the back. If you haven't been to East End Books, it's about a stone's throw and a half from here. So if you just go down to the bottom of Pearl Street and hang a left, and it's right there on the right-hand side. It's a terrific little bookstore, and say hi to Jeff. Yeah, do stop by. It's a really great store. And also like to give a shout out to the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod and the Cape Cod 5 Foundation for so generously supporting our public programming during the summer. Restrooms. Down the hallway on the left, there's a drinking fountain opposite if you need it. Cushions. Yep, they're still back there. If you need one, be sure to grab one. We have assisted listening devices at the back. If that would make the quality of your enjoying this event better, please connect with Hannah or Fatima, and they'll set you up with one of those. And I'd just like to ask you all, as always, to silence you're reaching for your pocket before you even say it, silence your cell phones so that we can give our full attention to the wonderful presenters who are about to come to the stage. We're going to welcome Doug to the stage first, and to introduce Doug, we're going to bring up one of his students. Please welcome to the stage Pandora Peoples.
Self-professed baseball addict Doug Bauer only needs AC and a refrigerator to be comfortable. Alert to sentimentality, he doesn't subscribe to the piety of rule breaking because there are no rules in writing. It just needs to work. As a teacher, Doug Bauer really encourages open-mindedness toward finding our own unique self-expression, voice, and journey. Damn good writer Doug Bauer has written 7 books. His most recent, The Beckoning World, was longlisted for the Massachusetts Book Award in Fiction, and his 2013 book, What Happens Next? Matters of Life and Death, won the Penn New England Award in Nonfiction. He's won grants from the National Endowment for the Arts in both fiction and creative nonfiction. Doug's taught at Harvard, where he's won 2 Harvard Danforth Center Awards for being a damn good teacher. He's taught at Rice University, Smith College, and the Bennington College writing seminars. Maybe you'll find him at the Dugout on Comm Ave, where the babe himself enjoyed his drink. Please put your hands together for Doug Bauer.
That was very good. Absolutely. Thanks so much, Pandora. What a nice surprise. Hi, everyone. I'm just delighted to be here. This is my first time at the Work Center, and it certainly lives up to every good thing I've heard about it and more. And I particularly want to thank David and Sarah and everyone else, the assistants who have just made it absolutely easy for all of us this week. So thanks for that. I'm going to read from The Beckoning World, which Pandora mentioned, which came out a little more than a year ago. And I'm just going to read from the start, from the beginning, so I don't have to explain anything. It will begin at the beginning. No context required. The only thing I would ask you to sort of pay attention to is that I'm reading two sections, a prologue, which takes place in 1918 and sort of portends events which then subsequently occur in the next section, chapter 1, which takes place 9 years earlier, if you follow that. So I think that's all I'm going to tell you. Prologue, October 15th, 1918. The two soldiers left Macaulay's general store with their sacks of black licorice and hard molasses candies and sat down on the bench just outside the door to watch the life of the village moving past. They were tall and lanky and fair-complexioned young men, and in their handsome, high-collared uniforms, they resembled one another very closely. One was 19, the other was 20. The 20-year-old bore a prominent scar, the feature that distinguished them, which ran beneath his lower lip like a plump white worm. They lit cigarettes and smoked in relaxed silence. They greeted the people passing by, tipping their caps to the women and nodding to the men, returning crisp salutes to those who crisply gave them. Their voices, when they said hello, were high-pitched and respectful. People were surprised, some even startled, to come upon the two of them, these look-alike soldiers enjoying the ideal autumn sun. There was, in their handsomeness and the occasion of their being there, an aura of something like celebrity about them. And only later, as the shocking news spread, did people think to ask how they'd found their way from wherever they were camped on a Tuesday afternoon to that bench in front of Macaulay's store. As the soldiers sat there, a bird, a squawking blue jay, flew overhead and shat, hitting the small spot of bench between the two of them. They burst out laughing and began to argue about whether the bird had found or missed its target. Maybe it had been a sharpshooter taking morning target practice, aiming for that very spot and hitting it exactly. Or maybe it had flown all the way across the ocean to patrol the American skies, trained by the Huns to look down for anyone in a uniform to shit on. They sat a few minutes more, softly chuckling, pleased with their silliness, until the soldier with the scar said he was feeling lightheaded. At the same time, he was having trouble getting his breath. He'd started smoking just a few days before, and he knew the cigarette was the reason for his dizziness and for the sense that his chest was suddenly closing. He flicked the cigarette away, goddamn weeds, why'd I start, and ground it beneath his boot. He reached into his uniform's tunic pocket for the handkerchief and blew his nose, and the cloth came away streaked luridly with blood. His friend helped him stand and asked an old woman who'd stopped to gawk at them for directions to a doctor. The house was fortunately close by, and when they got to the address, they were told by the shy widow who helped the doctor run his office that he'd left an hour ago, a house call in the country. As they sat waiting in the parlor, the soldier with the scar was growing very frightened and working not to show it. And after a while, he turned to his friend and told him he should leave, that he'd be fine and they would both be in trouble if one of them didn't report back to their unit and explain what had happened. His friend rose with some reluctance and said he was sure their lieutenant would tell him to return right away, bearing orders for where to rejoin them the next day. and the soldier with the scar said he was sure of this too. Left alone with the shy widow who thought to bring him tea with lemon, he felt free to gasp desperately for breath, furious rhythms of breath, and after a while, from inside the first of the delusions he would suffer, he heard the gawking old lady who'd given them directions telling him he'd done right to send his friend away. He died early that evening, lying on the office cot, bathed in sweat. The doctor just returned, holding a washpan under his chin to catch the coughed-up blood. Word traveled swiftly through the town. Many more than had actually seen the young soldiers or been anywhere near them during their brief, sorrowful visit described passing the two of them so memorably striking as they sat there on the bench. As the news was repeated over and over, the soldiers became twins, bearing an uncanny resemblance. To see them sitting next to one another outside Macaulay's store was to have seen double. A few remembered noticing the prominent scar. Have I got it right? He's the one that died? And eventually this detail was folded into the lore as having been some sort of childhood accident, which the twin who'd suffered it was probably glad for, if not at first, then in time, since the scar was the thing that made him separate from his brother. People said the fact that one had caught the influenza and the other had not felt even more haunting since the young men were identical. Someone said it was as if the scar was a mark made by God to help him remember which one to give the influenza to. This appealed to a few as biblically compelling, some vengeful Old Testament episode, and they eagerly passed it on. But most, when hearing it, said hogwash. The influenza wasn't the Lord's doing, and even if people look exactly alike, the Lord hardly needs any help keeping them straight since he made us all to start with. When word of the soldier's death reached Earl, he thought immediately of the supper table talk they'd had a few nights before when he'd learned of their visit to Macaulay's store. How innocent that conversation seemed to him now as he heard it in his head. How woefully ignorant. The way the family had joked about the soldiers being there, and then thinking of them as such a perfect pair, it inspired Earl to wonder why the one and not the other, and to imagine that the soldier who'd survived, wherever he disappeared to, wherever was the unit he needed to rejoin, must be asking the same thing. Why him and not me too? Thinking more, thinking harder, Earl began to see it as an instance of his long-held belief in life's fated randomness. This is where his thoughts took him. It's as far as they extended. It was as if with his embrace at last of the life he'd made his way to, Earl now saw it as impregnable, that life, its pleasures as immune, and the fear that should have seized his heart when he heard the news did not. Instead, what came to mind was the morning in Chicago when he was 17, the day he rode the elevated train, and looking from his window into the tenement he passed, he saw the filthy little urchin, that half-naked dreamer who appeared to want the world, looking out his window and waving madly at the train, and Earl waving back as if waving to his twin. Chapter 1. 9 years earlier. His life, Earl Dunham's life in the coal mines, began when he was 12, in the camp town of Evans near the hamlet of Beacon in the subtly steep hills of southeastern Iowa. He sat for 10 hours a day, his long legs bent at praying mantis angles, on a pine board bench with a dozen other boys watching coal move past on a conveyor belt. Hunched over, his eyes squinting and alert, he reached into the unceasing flow of coal to remove the impurities, the pieces of slate, their edges as sharp as razor blades. Soon into the morning, his hands, like everyone else's, were bleeding from new cuts and from freshly opened old ones. The boys were forbidden from wearing gloves. The company believed gloves made it too difficult to grasp the shards of slate. The air was granular, a weather of black dust as dense as hell's hot fog. The boys wore bandanas to cover their noses and their mouths. They looked like a gang of child outlaws in blackface. Their boss walked back and forth behind them. When he sensed their minds were wandering, he shouted, "Hey-ya!" a herding call to livestock, and struck them in the back with a heavy stick. Their postures and their thoughts came instantly to attention. Some of the boys' backs showed ladder rungs of bruises climbing their spines. Their boss was doing them a favor. Often, those who got distracted got their hands and arms caught in the conveyor. It was 1909. The mine was named Eureka. Earl mostly avoided the boss's stick. He was able to keep his eyes on the belt of passing coal while his thoughts took him away to the vital places in his life, his bed, for instance, where he wished he still lay sleeping, or his mother's every Sunday dinner of fatback and beans and cornbread, or actually any hour of Sunday, since Sunday was his day of light above the ground. Especially the Sundays in spring and summer and into early fall when the men and boys played baseball, virtually dawn to dark, on the dirt lot behind a double row of rundown miners' cottages. The coal being poured from the cars onto the belt was a deafening cascade. The conveyor's wheels and gears groaned and screeched, operatic sounds, great suffering complaint. Muffled in their masks, the boys stayed silent as they worked. There was no way their voices could be heard in the high chaos of noise. And really, what was there to say about this world that they hadn't learned, hadn't felt, hadn't mumbled to themselves in the first hour of the first day they descended into it? At 14, Earl left the pine board bench to become a coal car driver in the mines. He stood at the front of the car, the reins in his hands, guiding the mules along the underground tracks. This work was not so grim, and Earl's mind was naturally fanciful, younger than his age, and he liked to pretend he was steering a chariot in battle. 2 more years passed before he became a miner, laboring in the warrens of rooms carved out of the coal. He swung his pick into the walls, leaving the supporting pillars of coal. But the company wanted that coal too, and his challenge became a delicate felling of the pillars while he stayed poised to flee should the room start to collapse. He willed the task a kind of death sport, as close to play as he could make it, a contest between his talent with the pick and the mine's eagerness to kill him. He left the camp in Evans a year later to escape not the mines, but his father, Sean. They often ended up working side by side, and it seemed to Earl that at some point every morning, his father would slip in, stepping out of the dark, to stand next to him, a smirk on his face. In the closet-close space, his father's elbow or his hip frequently grazed Earl, and his father's touch in any form, in any way, revulsed Earl. The rhythmic meanness of this life meant that the two of them had a lot to quarrel about as they drank at the table after supper. Earl got drunk quickly. He hadn't, at his age, learned to hold his liquor. He never would. Age had little to do with it. Slouched in a kitchen chair, he would look past the low doorway into the tiny sitting room where his mother, Dorothea, sat with her knitting in the weak lamplight, her eyes straining, her forehead scored with lines of concentration. She appeared oblivious, indifferent to the voices in the kitchen. To her, they were simply the routine after-supper sounds. One night, as Earl and his father argued, it came suddenly to Earl why they fought so eagerly. It was because they hated each other. His father hated him, and Earl had grown to hate his father in return. This was a straightforward insight, one that simply presented itself to Earl, pure, like a bestowal. A feeling of lightness and reprieve moved through his drunkenness and reached his heart. And he saw then that his father hated the whole of life, but with an appetite that thrilled him, and that it thrilled him most when he was drunk, when his hatred was a love for every ugly second of it. That night, his father was shouting on about Earl's ignorance in general, and in particular some pansy-ass thing he'd seen him do that day. Swing his pick so recklessly at one point, by all rights, the ceiling should have fallen, should have killed them all. You and a slug trade brains, he'd fucking lose. From inside his epiphany, Earl heard all this as noise in the far distance. He rose slowly from his chair and placed both hands on the table to steady himself. Much taller than his father, he loomed over him. "Where are you going?" Sean asked, affronted. In the kitchen shadows, his wrinkled face looked flat as an iron's. Earl said nothing. He left the kitchen unsteady on his feet, needing to breathe some outside air. But at the door he paused. His work shovel and his pick stood there, propped up against the wall next to his father's. He reached for the shovel and held it, testing its weight and balance in his hands. He looked to be imagining it for some new purpose, and he was. He was picturing himself coming back into the kitchen with the shovel and striking the bastard at the side of the head. His father had hit him routinely when he was younger, before he grew tall and strong and could easily fend him off. He'd hit Earl hard enough to knock him down, but not so hard he couldn't get up, which is to say his father had a miner's touch for the strength with which to swing a pick. And now Earl saw the shovel crushing his father's cheek and jawbone. He saw him dropping to the floor, blood seaming from his ear. His eyes rolled back in his head, their whites showing improbably pretty, like a pair of ivory buttons. But as he imagined the blow, Earl could only hear it as a dull, flat thud, and he felt greatly let down by this softly muted violence. He needed the shovel to ring murderously as it struck, and the depth of his disappointment frightened him. He set the shovel down and told himself what he must do. He lay awake the following night until he heard his parents' snores through the wall. He rose, already dressed. He'd already packed as well, his few possessions stuffed into an old gunny sack. He tiptoed past their room to the kitchen. He'd written a note saying he'd be untraceable. He said he'd send repayment soon for the money he was stealing from the sitting room cabinet. He placed the note on the table, opened the door, and stepped outside. The night was moonless and starless, and the sky was pale with clouds. He spent the rest of the night hiding in one of the storage huts next to the mine shaft. When he heard the first work whistle, his heart leapt to the fact that this would not be a day like all the days to which that sound had wakened him. He hurried from the hut and waited in high weeds next to the railroad tracks, and when the Minneapolis and St. Louis train arrived to fill its cars, he climbed into an empty boxcar. He rode east with the coal. He had something like a thought that he and the coal were escaping together. He didn't know his rare good fortune at having the boxcar to himself. No hobos, no criminals, no feral perverts, just a family of emigrating rats, as he quickly came to see them, scurrying about but keeping considerately to their corner of the car, their eyes tiny bright pins shining from scattered nests of straw. Otherwise, the grander world he sought was visible to him as a vertical stripe of blurred countryside, barely wider than a ribbon, made by the gap where the car's sliding doors didn't quite meet. And it was world enough for Earl. He spent 3 nights in Chicago in an uptown boarding house on Wilson Avenue. He was 2 months shy of 18. His deep brown eyes were bovine with innocence. His thatch of sandy hair was thick and untamable. His very large ears lay fortunately close to his head. He looked like a river rascal out of Twain. The weather was hot, the air so humid it had a thickness almost tactile. but Earl's first night there, he lay shivering with excitement. He came to the open window and looked down. He saw a group of men on the sidewalk below. They wore soot-powdered derbies and frayed straw boaters. He watched and listened as they laughed and argued and spat in several languages. He saw packs of boys, potato-faced hooligans, running wildly among the men like fierce pets off their leashes. He watched them racing about in the street, heard their cries of vicious joy, and what Earl saw was a permission to move crazily wherever impulse took you, because life let you do it. Early the next morning, he boarded an elevated train. He had no destination. Like a boy at an amusement park who discovered a new ride, he simply wanted to be on another train. He rattled through the city at a southeast meander. His car was sparsely filled at this early weekend hour. He left his seat and made his way to the open platform at the front. The city's sky was pewter-colored and held its sulfurous smell, but Earl compared it to what he was used to breathing at this hour, and to him the air was crystalline, its scent was ambrosial. Smelled like the stockyards this morning. Earl turned to see who'd said this. It was another passenger stepping out onto the platform. He wore denim overalls and a stained wool cap. "I've smelled worse," Earl said. "You know, I can make a joke at your expense," said the man. His smile was satisfied. "I could say, you mean there's days you smell worse than you do now?" I could say that, but I won't. Earl was taking in the morning with too much pleasure to be bothered, and he said in response, "And you can see the sun." He closed his eyes and gave his face to it. "The sun? Well, the sun shines everywhere, praise the Lord," said the man. "No, it don't," said Earl, "not everywhere." The tracks cut with the authority of a primary vein through the packed-in neighborhoods. The train slowed to a metal shrieking crawl for sharp turns, passing so close to rooming house windows, it seemed to Earl he could lean out and touch the people inside. There was an old man in his undershirt, his bones like brittle twigs. He held a magnifying glass to the newspaper he'd spread out on the table. A woman, looking ravaged as a Goya refugee, stood at her stove stirring something in a pot. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, and Earl imagined reaching in through the window and moving her lock of hair off her forehead. A boy, maybe 4 or 5, maybe 6 years old, stood on a chair at the window, his eyes avid for the morning. He wore a filthy T-shirt, but he was otherwise buck naked, his hooded little penis curling like a comma. And when he waved eagerly at the train crawling past, Earl waved eagerly back. Each world framed by its window drew Earl powerfully in. He saw the common squalor, but to him it looked exotic. Every room, every person, in every window he passed seemed to beckon him, to beckon him, to beckon him, to beckon him. Thank you.
Another round of applause for Doug Bauer. Thank you, Doug. It's marvelous. And for a heck of an introduction. Thank you, Pandora. It was really wonderful. And now I'd like to welcome to the stage a student of Megan's to introduce her. Please welcome to the stage Martha Rothman.
Megan Hinton is an artist, art scholar, educator, curator, and writer. Since I first met Megan in Wellesley in 2016, when she had a painting exhibit at Wellesley Preservation Hall, she's been constantly reinventing her painting practice, expanding to encompass collage, sculpture, installation, photography, printmaking, and performance. I think I've taken many courses since that 2016 with Megan, but this one is special. She's included all of these media, if you want to call it that, in her current workshop at Falk, Expansive Painting, which expands way beyond everything else I've done with you. She fuses subject and formalism, objective, figurative, landscape, external and internal landscape. We have a small piece from the Wood Fleet of a couple of years ago that has a baseball hat and paintbrush on it. So that's Megan's internal landscape. And abstraction. In 2020, she earned an MFA in Interdisciplinary Studio Art from Mills College in California, where she won the Hung Lui Painting Prize. Her residency fellowships have included 20 summers in Provincetown and workshops or residencies in Belgium and in Brittany, which was the subject of that first exhibit that we saw at Preservation Hall. Most recently, her most recent award is the Alice C. Cole Merit Grant from Wellesley College. As a teacher, and artist, she is transformative. As a teacher, she brings her breadth of exploration and depth of understanding in art history and practice that is integral to her own work. Thank you, Falk, for bringing Megan Hinton to us this summer.
Wow, Martha Rothman, thank you for that introduction. Thank you for taking a lot of my classes and for being you and your husband Elliot for being such supportive friends over the years. Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. There's a lot of artists in the room and artist friends and writers, and I just love being a part of this world of creation with you all. So thanks for coming. I want to thank Falk for welcoming me in this summer to teach. My first class here was online in 2021, and so it's really nice to be here physically. It's a lovely community, and I just want to take a moment to thank the staff, David, Sharon, Sarah, all of you who I'm not mentioning. You know, they're here from like really early in the morning through the evening every day, really. In the summer, it's like devotional, and they're very organized, kind, intelligent staff. And let's give it up for the staff. Thank you. Yeah. I have to use this little thingy here. So my class, Expansive Painting, I just want to talk about the class a little bit because, you know, that's why we're here. I have 5 excellent students. And Expansive Painting, someone was like, oh, is that a class about doing large painting? Well, it could be, but it's actually a class about define traditions of painting to access new modalities of painting while maintaining painting. And this is just a found text from a painting studio, so we're regarding expansive painting here that I took a photograph of. Am I doing something wrong? Is this the arrow that you push to move the slide board?
It's a trick.
Oh, there's a trick.
It's a trick.
Oh, okay, thank you. Great. Yes. So here's a picture of Martha making, our first class involved an automatic painting assignment from the surrealist approach to painting called automatism. And I asked the class to come up with 5 problems of painting, 5 problems they're having with their painting, whether it's space, resources, fear. There were some really juicy ones. And we took those 5 problems and we did this kind of unconscious, automatic painting drawing of each problem. And then, well, this is actually a different project, and I don't have a picture of it, but then we cut up the work and offered 5 solutions to these problems to make these solution collages to override the problem, to find some sort of solution. So that was our first project on Monday. And then we did a great class called Reconstruct, where I asked them to bring in either a found painting, like from the thrift store, or a painting that they were detached from, maybe that they found was a failure in their own practice. And we basically cut them up, tore them up, and then reconstructed them to access a 3D mode of working, whether through wall sculpture or sculpture that encompassed space. So these were some of the outcomes. And then today, they prepped by taking 10 objects, whether they were attached to these objects or found objects or recycled material. And we have 6 people in the workshop, including myself. So each person got a color. There were 3 primaries, 3 secondaries, chose a color to talk about monochromes and isolated color or connotative color that is sort of a symbol color for you. And they painted those 10 objects. And we then went to the beach this morning and did like an intervention installation into public space. And here's a member of our class, Beth, interacting with the sculpture. And what we were doing was trying to figure out how we could encompass space, intervene on space, and use color relationships by using shapes and forms rather than committing to putting a swath of paint on a surface that was permanent. By this means they could move the painting components around and try different things, whether through isolation, separation, connection, and it was a collaborative project. Here's Gordon contemplating what we just did. And like we did things, we took it to the shoreline while the tide was coming in. We went to the library to even more public space, and that was a little bit more challenging because it felt very public, but this amazing thing happened. I mean, we did not plan for those petunias to be in the shot, but it really worked. With the lovely lady up there. So that's the nice thing about making interventions, that there's these unplanned things that kind of start to become incorporated. And the final product of this is this documentation. These forms are, maybe they'll be trashed, maybe they'll be saved forever, but this is how this exists right now. And then the final project, which actually was my favorite, was playing around with the fire lane on the side of Pearl Street at Falk. And this was the idea that there's found painting on the lane, just by the written word, the text fire is a painting, essentially, fire lane. And then we put the objects into the fire lane to intervene on, to see this differently. Here are my our workshop participants. They're a lovely, smart, open group. They're kind of quiet, which is actually really nice. And I don't mean that like they're contemplative, you know? And I'm really excited to work with them for the next 2 days. So I'm gonna just talk about my work now, and I'm also gonna introduce, as I kind of do, other artists' work, and the artist's work might be directly related to my own painting, but it might just be artists that inform me in some kind of way. And I've broken this up to use the word expansive into these different sort of genres or ways of working or types of art modalities. And I'm gonna start with work that I'm gonna do like a quick 10-year period of my work. So work that started around 2014. And I started out as a landscape painter. And you'll see that I tend to do like these bodies of work or series of work, and I kind of exhaust them and I move to something completely different, or relatively the same, however you want to look at it. but expansive landscape. This is just a shot from my studio, and I thought this was, even though this was my palette, it could be indicative of a landscape image. So just to talk about my influences a little bit, there was a movement in France in the mid-20th century called art informel, and the term describes various approaches to abstract painting in Europe from the 1940s and 50s, which had in common an improvisatory methodology and highly gestural technique of painting, and also referred to as the French word tachisme. Tache in French means to stain, like to stain a canvas. Matter painting is another word for art informel, and more commonly in the US, lyrical abstraction. It mainly refers to European art, but does also embrace like American abstract expressionism. An important source of this kind of painting was the surrealist doctrine that I mentioned before of automatism. So for me, more than the New York school, this movement in Europe, particularly in France, was important to me because it actually hinted more at realism than non-objective painting. And this is one of my early influences, Nicolas de Stael, the Russian-French painter, who lived a short life but did this incredible body of impasto-based work based on, like a lot of his work was based on topographical architecture and limited color palettes. And then Pierre Talcote, who's a lesser-known matter painter or in the movement of art informel, did these kind of like unconscious, subconscious, dreamlike landscapes from his interior world of vision. And I start to think about this in relationship to the painter that everyone's talking about, the late painter Matthew Wong. Susan Rothenberg, she's important. She died recently, and she's been important to me for a long time. She did very large-scale paintings, and she was influenced by Philip Guston's 1970 show that brought imagery back into painting after a long haul with non-objective painting from the New York school. And she kind of embraced this expressive way of painting, influenced by lyrical abstraction, but she took the permission to bring image back into painting and even landscape in a time in American art when painting was deemed dead. So that was very influential, and she worked in the style that I relate to, although I'm trying to get away from this style a little bit, called correctively, which is multiple layers of work, multiple sessions on a particular painting. And so 10 years ago, I've lived out here since 2007, and my partner, Paula Erickson, and I, who did the wave and brought the flowers, we do a lot of walking, and we go on the back shore, and the back shore here is the ocean side, the wild ocean side. And I wanted to paint the landscape. I wanted to be a part of landscape painting, but I wanted to paint it in a subject way that wasn't sort of tied into like traditional ways of looking at it, like just a simple house or a wharf. And so I was looking for a subject, and I was noticing all of these lobster traps. You'll notice them if you haven't already, washed ashore. And what I found fascinating by these is that the box, the lobster trap box, this like homogenized box that's used to entrap an animal for human consumption, was washed ashore in some sort of storm or big tide, and it was they'd be individually contorted in these interesting abstract forms that were not like their original form. So this immediately lent me to investigate a body of work based on these forms that looked figurative, abstract, and these were all kind of informed by art informel or matter painting. So pieces came about: mesh, drift net, repose, tangle, loosen, free. Expansive figuration. This is a recent Breeders concert at the House of Blues in Boston. So I was noticing around 2016 a lot of political stuff going on and a lot of pictures in the newspapers of people gathering in spaces. And I was noticing that all of this mass of people, they were also creating a singular form. And this is from a Bernie Sanders rally I went to at Johnson State College in 2016. And so I was really interested in how to depict this sort of singular form and like this divided mark that was happening in these pictures of singular figures. And I started looking at Peter Bruegel the Younger, particularly his works from the 17th century. And something radical that he did at the time was, you see how, is this the pointer? Yeah. You see how the red goes through the entire canvas? So that's a pretty high color device to lead you through this, what is called the wedding dance. And it is a singular form, but upon closer scrutiny, you look at these figures in relationship in sort of this like debauchery or fun or whatever you want to call it. There's these very complex human relationships going on. Now, I didn't quite approach it with this realism, but in 2015, I went to see Jacob Lawrence, the Migration Series show at the MoMA, and I didn't even realize that it had influenced me. And he did these really beautiful paintings of African Americans migrating in the South to major cities to work in industry. And so with this influx, outflux of people, he came up with the story of this migration. And he used this very difficult painting medium, which I think is difficult, maybe other painters, we could talk about this later, of casing and tempera. It's like sort of this milky paint on board. But I was just fascinated by how the colors were so distilled down and spare. There was not a lot of color on the palette, and then the minimalism of the figures sort of powered up the image or the total form of the figures. And then I was sort of interested in like what these people were relating to outside of the plane of the picture. And so certain paintings came about. Action. A board. Line. Fanatics. Acclamation. Waiting. Walkout. So the idea was that there was a spectacle happening off the canvas, or an idea about why these people were gathering in place. Expansive installation. As Martha mentioned, I went to get my MFA in my mid-career, and it was a big decision. And I left the Cape after living here for quite a few years to move to California. And I went to Mills College, which was previously, when I went there, it was a women's college. It was one of the scant few women's college left on the West Coast. And now it's actually been taken over by Northeastern. But it was a small interdisciplinary program, and I went there because they had big studios, small program. And I had been working as a painter for so long, I wanted to overhaul my practice. And the first thing I did when I got to Mills was I completely abandoned color and stopped working in color because I didn't want to deal with color relationships anymore. I was sort of tired of trying to think about how it was working because in my opinion, it's the biggest problem of painting is color. And I don't mean like a problem, like a personal problem, but a problem that needs to be solved. And so I just wanted to like get it out of my life for a little while. And I just started kind of working in this black and white collage. And I cleared the studio space, and I was hearkening back to my days in growing up in Ohio as a basketball player, and I had this sort of stunted experience with sports. Like I was really into it when I was young, but there were some like coding things and gender issues within the sport that I felt really uncomfortable with, so I quit. And it was always this sort of source of like a problem for me that I did not continue to play. And I thought like being an artist and being an athlete were two separate things. So in order to reclaim that, I just decided that I wanted to start exploring sculpture, and I dipped a basketball into this printmaking ink, which is sticky, so it would stick to the floor, and I drew out this court, the net, the hoop, the key, into the space of this room, and the drawing actually is flat on a surface, but it encompasses space. And through that performance, it kind of opened up a lot of things for me. And I started to kind of started to investigate this sort of deeply personal body of work. I was looking at Carolee Schneemann. I've been looking at this piece for a long time. It's called Up to and Including Her Limits. This piece was done at the Kitchen Art Space in New York and from 1973 to 76. And she was kind of reacting against the masculinity of Jackson Pollock's Ab X in New York. And what I found fascinating was that like she encompassed the whole room and like fixed her nude body onto a harness coming from the ceiling and sort of flung herself around this room. And she kind of, it's a performance, but she also kind of rejects performance because there's no fixed audience. People would walk into this space, there's no real technical cues, and there's like an unconscious intention here. So that was really meaningful. And then I've always been fascinated with Keith Haring, and I don't paint like Keith Haring, but I think the way that he approached art making with complete confidence is remarkable for such a short life. And he had this free-flowing line, or like, he never really like picked up the paintbrush. He just flowed through his work, and he did a lot of these room drawings with these personal symbols. And then Jessica Stockholder, this is called A Freezer, 2015. I was looking at her at the time that I went to Mills, and she gave me a lot of permission to do things, particularly use found imagery in my work. Stockholder challenges boundaries between artwork and display environments, and between pictorial and physical experience to make paintings in space. So pieces followed that were offshoots of drawing court, like Return to Barbizon. And Barbizon is a French school of painting, like a romantic school of painting. Barbizon is actually a town in France. And I was trying to like romanticize my relationship with basketball to reclaim it, and also think about how I could use particular objects like a basketball and a belt and found lumber and like a very distilled orientation with this Barbizon landscape in the background in the architecture of this space to talk about a new type of figuration. And then actually this is a crowd scene drawing. You can't really see it down here. This is a photocopy of one of my crowd drawings that came back in. And then at Mills, I did a larger piece called Free Throw on the Line. The coach in high school, when we didn't win, the first thing he'd say at practice is get on the line, and we had to do suicides. I don't know if any of you played basketball, if you know what a suicide is, and it was an extremely difficult, punishing situation. So I was sort of talking about that experience. There's I'll just zoom in. Oh, you can see it here. There's a belt, the belt with the basketball, and the shot, the hoop is way down low, and the shot is in like a suspension as if the shot will never be made. And the important thing about this piece is I started to bring in, these are all discarded easels, discarded student paintings, and I kind of started tearing apart these easels to make this basketball court. And I was thinking about like Duchamp and the ready-made, and then I was thinking about this idea of the ready mark, found mark making from other people's hands in painting. And so those are like actually, those are marks from other people's painting, from drips on easels. And I was really challenging myself to build something, to see if I could build and cut and make crazy angles. And this was the beginning of me using this, what I call the ready mark of painting. Another very personal project was called, it's not really installed anywhere, is called Red Return. When you're a redhead, which actually we have orange hair, so I've always been curious about why we're called redheads, and I'm kind of a darker redhead now, but people, especially in my young life, would call me red. And I found that endearing, but I also found it like somewhat like marking and like othering in a way that felt uncomfortable. And I called this piece Red Return. And when I was in California, I was going back and forth a lot between the Cape and Oakland, and constantly like coming back to my home and my family with my partner and our animals, and then leaving. And I was thinking about like what I always had to take and what was left at home. And I did this piece, Red Return, and I was thinking about like what I couldn't fit into this way of moving back and forth. And then feeling slightly dislocated with multiple spaces and geographic distance. And I don't know if you can see it on the slide, but this is a photograph of my jeans, an espresso maker, an actual espresso maker, a painting of a California raisin container, a painting of a book, a painting of a shirt, and these other objects. And I was thinking about how by putting in photography, painted image, the replication of an image through painting, and actual objects together, that this could create a continuity, but could also create a dislocation, which is how I was sort of feeling. And then 2020 came, and I came back and graduated from my program online, and that was sort of very disappointing, but we took the opportunity to do some expansive interventions, kind of like we did today in class. This is painted found lumber and wicker chair installed at Ryder Beach in Truro. And just sort of playing around with open space and landscape space. And again, a way to like defy how landscape is depicted out here. And I was really influenced, I've been for a long time fascinated with this piece, Walter DeMaria's New York Earth Room. He put a bunch of dirt in a Soho loft. And the question comes up, like, why is this art? And it's art because it completely defies our expectation of a space. And it also brings in this like other sensory idea that art could feel like, could have a scent, could have a insular sound kind of feeling. And so by intervening on this space, someone might stumble upon it and sort of discover it as well. So that's interesting to me. I got the opportunity to work with this really amazing performance artist named Ernesto Pujol, who has a social practice, performance practice. And in 2015, I went on this sort of artist retreat called the Art of Consciousness. And Ernesto kind of opened up a group of us to being a conscious artist, and it opened up a real like spiritual and growth place for me in my work and how I approached life in general. So he was doing a lot of interventions like this. This is a piece he did at the ICA where he dressed like a white colonial person and walked around. So in 2020, this is April of 2020, and Paula said to me, and we were living in Wellfleet at the time, and she said to me, oh, there's a desk that you'll love at the Wellfleet DPW yard. And she knew I kind of like these like patina, decrepit objects. And, you know, we were isolated. And so I collected a bunch of objects from my office space and also like nostalgic office space gear. And I did this piece called Remote Office. And it was in the middle, at the height of the pandemic, and with this big notion of working remotely, materials gathered from an office space, both current and nostalgic, and painted in a monochromatic or isolated connotative color of orange. Orange is attention-grabbing and also signals caution, which I thought was appropriate during this pandemic. It's also energetic, enthusiastic, exciting, and is around and used to create energy levels. And so this idea of like working remotely in this little bedroom with like 5 people around you, or you know, not having a space to work, that you want to be as productive as possible, although we're going through this major human crisis. So that was sort of something I was thinking about. And it was just a really fun, lively thing to do during the pandemic. And the art was outside of the space of the institution or the gallery, and people came by it. They might not know it was art, but they could definitely be surprised by it. And here's just some close-up views of the piece. And this was like I said, the DPW yard where they store picnic tables and marine equipment. So painting takes on a different type of still life here, where the objects are actually painted on instead of reinterpreted. Asked Paula to dress in monochrome orange and do a silent sort of performance, photo performance with the piece. There's even like a little dustbuster down there in the corner. We had a lot of fun with this, being isolated together, and she did a great job with it, and really, when I told her what to do, she just showed up, and it was perfect. So it's this idea of working without connection to the internet in this contemporary way of communicating, as we were isolated yet overloaded with connection. Even the umbrella was painted orange. So that was fun. It's really fun to paint on objects if you've never done it before. Over time, remote office decayed and got moldy and wet, and people put things like whiskey bottles on it, and buoys and things like that. It molded, it blew away. So it started to become like a trash issue, and eventually we cleared it up and took it out. Waiters, marine equipment. But, you know, I remember being on Facebook and someone posted this. I was like, does anyone know who did this? So it was really cool to just have a piece out there that wasn't really for anything but whoever might have seen it. Okay, I'm moving through. I know I don't want to take up too much more time, but I just want to show you a bit more. So pieces followed during that pandemic summer, like this piece called Rainmaker. And so this is just yellow material that's gathered together. And where are my notes? What does this say? Okay, yes. So I used the color yellow because yellow indicates, as a connotative color, a sign of hope. I don't know how, I was researching like what colors mean. And we were in drought. And we were trying to grow stuff, and I put this on the curb of my house, and I wanted people to pass it by, and there's even like an old asphalt situation from Herring Cove, and a gold trash can, and a flag, and a raincoat, and these were things were also painted on, a potted plant with yellow flowers, and it was just a call for rain. And remarkably, when just as I was, I'm not even joking. Just as I finished the installation, it started to rain. It did. And then further pieces happened, like Cultivate. This is in my studio. Again, like kind of with Red Return, like packing things into a a found and dilapidated wheelbarrow. I put that on the curbside too, because I felt like I was signaling to my neighbors and people passing by, and like shouting out to them to like look at this sort of peculiar object. It's kind of ineffable. I don't really know what it means, but I think the color was talking about strong emotions, love, desire, maybe even anger. And I wanted to passion up and heat up the curbside view, add a curious sculpture there in a desolate and isolated time to send love and things of curiosity, to ask questions and to pique interest, signals, if you will, to the passersby. It saw this at Farm Projects Gallery in Wellfleet, and you kind of had to walk around it to get into the gallery. And I had a show in 2020 during the pandemic, and it was installed there in the yard. And you know, the coolest thing is that someone sold the basketball. I don't know, fine. Talk about detachment. So that was kind of great. If they needed one, that's great. And then I'm moving through. I'll move through this quickly. This is expansive material. So all of those installations and experiences brought me back to painting with the permission to incorporate assemblage and collage, to use alternative materials, particularly scraps of my work that were discarded, found lumber as a surface for painting, particularly found lumber with paint on it, and the ready marks from other painters' work, found paintings, or reproductions of paintings. This rejection of material, of cutting into material and cutting it out, was a way to reconstruct and expand traditional ways of painting. I just want to show you a few more artists. These are the painted stones of Max Ernst, where he painted some of the stone and not some of the other parts of the stone. I saw these somewhere, sometime, and I don't know where it was. I think it might have been in Europe somewhere. Here's a colored version. These are really beautiful pieces, and like kind of this one, but I think maybe writers do it too, but art's like, why didn't I think of that? You know, moments. So his painted stones, this was a way of painting. It's a version of automatic art, which the surrealists sought to express the subconscious mind. As Ernst turned the stone round and around in his hand, the skill of his brush allowed him to respond intuitively both to the object and to his own impulses. The secrets conveyed by these rune, not ruin, like Patricia said last night, same word, rune-like marks, are those of the artist's innermost non-rational self. And Alberto Burri was also a matter painter or art informel, lesser known painter from 20th century Italy, mid-20th century Italy. This piece is called Sacking Red. He actually used a lot of these jute sacks that came from work with the Marshall Plan after World War II, this like remnants of material. And he explored the style of poly materials. He even said that his polyvinyl glue that he used was elevated to the same material importance of oil color. The jute sack was a way of painting with matter, where no longer is there a separation between painting surface and its form. And I've always been fascinated. I don't paint like her, and she's not really a painter. She's more of a sculptor of Lee Bonteque, how she put these voids into her work, or sort of holes to go into a painting, an erasure of void that powers up and dimensionalizes surface. So and then Richard Tuttle, the post-minimalist painter-sculptor, where his studio material expenditures made non-conforming shapes that deregulate traditional painting surfaces. And pieces that I made that followed, that were influenced by these, are Drop Catch, Game Face, Gesture with Gull, Crowd Spill, Cutter, Kitchen Ghost, Old Way, Up. And finally, expansive appropriations. This image is a piece by Banksy called Agency Job, and we don't have time to unpack this painting. It's really interesting, but it borrows from the 1857 Gleaner's painting by Jean-Francois Millet. If anyone wants to talk to me about this, I'd be happy to talk about it. It's pretty charged, but it is an appropriation, the idea of borrowing or stealing or reproducing another painter's work has recently come into my own work. This is an example from one of my early appropriations, like a couple years ago when I started working on this, of a painting I just completely enjoy looking at. It's Francois Boucher's 1751 Rococo painting called The Blonde Odalisque. And this painting is like simultaneously erotic, sweet, and comforting, but also something is about to happen here with the gaze of this sitter. And so I was just looking at this as a form, and I wanted to see how far I could take it away but use it from its original. And I did this piece called Reclining Nude, Oil Paper Remnants and Drawings of Remnants of Drawings on Panel. And I think I was trying to get away from the objectivity of this figure as well. The sexualized objectivity, if you will. So we all know this painting, Van Gogh's Bedroom in Arles, 1888, the first version. So last year I did a show titled Homage at Farm Projects in Wellfleet, and it was, my parents died in quick succession recently, about 3 months apart from each other. And I wanted to do a show about them, and I wanted to do a show about other painters' work simultaneously. So I started thinking about what my parents had, were into, liked, and what they had aversions to, what they didn't like. And my mother really liked antiques, and I grew up sleeping in this antique bed. It's like 3/4 bed. It's like somewhere in between a double bed and a single bed. And so what I did was I went back to sort of these famous or known paintings, and I'd pluck out an image and redraw it on these remnants or scraps of paintings I had in my studio that I discarded but didn't fully throw out, and cut out a panel to mimic the shape that I cut out, and then use that for a painting. So these became these sort of cut out paintings that were outside of our rectilinear form. This is a painter named Viola that I'm really interested in, who had spent some time in Provincetown, but mostly in France. She was Jack Torkoff's sister. They were from Poland, and they studied with Hoffman in Provincetown and New York, I believe. And I was thinking about my mother, how she loved Paris, but my father was also very interested, I wouldn't say very interested, but he went to church, and he went to a Methodist church. And so I made this painting called Our Lady, based on Biala's picture, and plucked that image out of Biala, so sort of simultaneously talking about two things that they were interested in. And then more recently, I've been looking at Provincetown painters or Outer Cape painters, historic ones, so sort of thinking about, I felt like I didn't really know much about, I kind of knew certain things about what was happening here, but I wanted to kind of investigate, and I started investigating the collection at PAM, and this is one of my favorite Provincetown painters named Arthur Cohen, who died in 2012. This piece is called Plymouth Belle at the Taves Boatyard from 1986. And recently I did this piece out of cut-out paintings and found lumber to reappropriate that image, except you see that it's kind of reversed. And then finally, I did a series of work recently called Cover, and I started collecting these vintage books with these gorgeous color linen covers that I don't know they make books like this anymore. And the linen kind of mimicked linen that one might paint on, except it was more of a hard surface, so it had a really lovely found colored surface to work on top of. And so I took these vintage books and made, I take the title of the book, the title of this book was called Meteorology, and then I was searched for a painting that I thought maybe I could reappropriate onto the cover. And what you see here is, this is a star that was found on the surface, was the graphic for the book, and this circle. And then I took that from Arthur Dove's Red Sun, 1935, to make that piece. Louise Fishman's Burnt Bridges, she abstract painter who recently died. I took this form to make this book cover piece called Selected Writings. And it actually, what it did was it loosened up my painting and allowed me to keep surface as part of work instead of over-painting and over-touching. And then finally, I'll offer you Picasso's Flowers of Peace. I used that to paint on a book, and this was the image, the graphic image that came on the book, and I painted in the white hands. The book title was This Body, the Earth. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Megan Hinton. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Marvelous. We're going to do a little Q&A. Look, got their hands up already. We're going to do a little Q&A. As always, please wait till Hannah or Fatima brings a microphone to you so our viewers at home can hear your questions. So we have a question up here, please.
I have a question for each of you. I wanted to know what a suicide is. You talked about that in the basketball.
Oh, a suicide. Oh, boy. You have well, we had to do them in 30 seconds, which is really fast. On a I'll try to make this brief. On a basketball court, there's different lines, and you start at the end line, and there's your closest free throw line, and there's a center line, and then there's your next free throw line, and then there's the end line. So what you do is you run to the first close free throw line, you run back, you run to the center line, you run back, you run to the second free throw line, you run back, and then you run to the end line, and then you run back in 30 seconds.
Okay. And also
because you feel like you're going to die.
Because it's so fast.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you talk about interventions, and I'm curious about the word use for the way you do the work. Could you explain the concept of like intervention in the way that you use it?
Yeah, so I guess an intervention for me could be anything outside of showing work in a traditional way. So if I were to take one of my paintings and put it on the beach, that could be an intervention because I'm sort of changing the way that you would normally expect to see something like that. So an intervention or intervening on what's expected.
Okay.
So, it could be intervention on space, how people engage with space, for example, as well. It's a good question.
And Doug, I'm just curious about the origin of the work that you read from. Like, what was the beginning of it? And, I mean, it's a fascinating story.
Well, I'm glad you felt that way about it. There's a couple of origins, if that's possible. We'd have two origins. The coal mining material really came from some research, but mostly it came from the fact that my maternal grandfather was a coal miner in that area of the Midwest. And I was always fascinated as a kid. By the time I knew him as a grandparent, he was virtually an invalid from black lung and was blind. But so he was always this kind of, exotic figure to me for that reason. And so I just was always interested in the kind of imagined what it would be like. As I say, there was one day of the week when he was above the ground, when he got light. And I found the irony of his spending most of his life below the ground, and then when he retired, he was blind as this sort of extraordinary, sort of larger-than-life creature. So that's one of the origins. But the actual origin for the novel was something you didn't hear at all tonight. Earl, the main character, is a baseball player. He's a professional baseball player in the early 20s. And my idea for this novel came when I was reading the New York Times one day, and I came across this article about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, who took a barnstorming tour after the 1918 series. And that just fascinated me. And I began to imagine them going to these little towns as they crossed on the train, on their train, and imagining them stopping in a little town in Iowa and playing a game, and that Earl would be a participant in that game himself. So the thing really came from reading about Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, which is far flung from what you heard tonight.
Thank you.
Megan talked a lot about the influences on her work, and Doug, I was interested if there were any particular kind of influences on your work, and also if those influences kind of are connected to certain books that you've written, or if you've found kind of consistent influences throughout your career.
I wouldn't so much call them influences as just inspirations. The writers I think of off the top of my head to think about what you just asked are ones I just admire in terms of their artistry, and they're always the ones that I couldn't imagine beginning to emulate, because I couldn't do what they do. I think of a writer like Don DeLillo, who I admire a lot, but he has a way of language and a way of rhythm in the prose that is just beyond my ability not to connect with. I connect with it fiercely, but I couldn't imagine sort of trying to in any way appropriate it. So those writers, I love Toni Morrison, as my class knows, as you know. I read everything, I hesitate to say the name at this point, but I read everything by Alice Munro, and I find her work astonishing. So that's kind of my relationship to influencers, as I say, more just admirers and that kind of attitude toward them.
Thank you.
I guess this question could be for both of you. Could you tell us a little bit more about your practice as an artist, as a writer, sort of when you like to create, what sort of inspires you on a daily basis, that kind of thing?
All right. I always have felt very lucky as a writer that when I began to write for a living, I was a magazine journalist, freelance. I was first a magazine editor, and then I thought, well, I'm young, I have no responsibilities to anyone but myself, so I'll just try this freelancing for a while, and it turned out to be about a decade of freelancing. And I began to think of it, I thought of it from the beginning as a job, in the sense that if I didn't get the piece done and sent into the magazine, I didn't eat. And so I just kind of always have approached it as work, as punching in every day. Every day I'm working. There are certainly times when I'm not working at all. But if I'm immersed in something, if I'm in the midst of a book, I tend to show up at the office about 9 o'clock in the morning and work till 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. and just do it that way with a kind of, pragmatic approach to it.
It's complicated, the practice. I try to, these days, I've had different ways of working, but these days I try to reserve my afternoons for my practice, 2 or 3 hours. If I'm lucky, I might be working in the morning, but I tend to get the business of the day sort of settled and then go in the afternoon and try not to book other appointments and things. But being in the studio involves a lot of different things and just not hands-on working. So I tend to take more of a break on the weekends. But I, like Doug, I see it as a job. And it's a job that I deeply love and am obsessed with. So if I'm not working, I feel like I need to be working, and there's that sort of push and pull away from it all the time. So if I can do something on a daily basis, I'm happy, but it's not linear for me exactly when I'm working, but I work regularly is the answer. So, yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the beautiful interventions, if I can use your word. I would like to know where both of you see art and writing in the era of AI. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
I'm terrified of it. I find it such a threat and so alien to anything I could imagine eventually collaborating with in any way. It just seems to me to be antithetical to anything I understand about creativity and the kind of individuality of the human mind and spirit that goes into one's art. And this notion of mimicry, artificially intelligent mimicry, just for me it is almost, it's a kind of a spiritual abandonment.
I agree with all of that. I think it's happening, but it's also not happening. Like, I know plenty of people who are making work and involved in a tactile experience with materials. And for me, when I'm working and I'm in process, there's a way that it's hard to explain. It's a place of richness where I'm thinking in a way that's outside ways that I normally think. Like, I'm making sort of discoveries and intelligent decisions that aren't like an expected way of making intelligent decisions. And that has a lot to do with material and using my hands and my eyes together. So I'm obviously wary of it, and I'm suspicious of it. But like with anything new, we tend to be fearful and in critique of it. So I completely agree with you, but I don't really know. I don't know what it even means. I mean, I could try to tell you what I think it means, but it's not, I don't really pay attention to it, to be honest with you. So, yeah, but it is happening, and it's happening in art. So it's a big conversation, yeah.
Hi, this is for each of you. Doug, when you're working on a project, I would like to know if you work on one project at a time, and if you're reading at the same time, and do you read multiple books at the same time, or do you read a book starting at the beginning and finish it before you read another one? I'm very curious about that, because, I mean, you've read a lot. And Megan, when you're working on a body of work, are you revisiting your old work? Are you still out looking at other work? Are you working on the whole body at one time, or are you just finishing a piece? It's like, I'm very interested in process. Thank you.
Well, I only write, I'm only working on one book at a time, although I sometimes put the book aside to do smaller pieces, essays, things of that sort, or teach a class or give a lecture. But I certainly don't have two ambitious projects going, two or more, at any one time. I'm hopelessly sort of single-minded, and I just keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the thing that I'm involved with at the moment. And I don't know, I couldn't possibly have that sense of immersion, that sort of vertical descent, if I was working on more than one thing at a time. I'm reading all the time, but there are certain writers that I stay away from when I'm in the midst of something, because I'm too easily influenced by them, and I just lose my bearings. So I mean, I guess that in some way that's the highest compliment you can give to a writer is don't read him when he's threatening you or she's threatening you. And what were the other things you were wondering about?
You read a book from cover to cover, or are you reading multiple books at the same time?
Sometimes I'm reading multiple books at the same time, but that's rare. I do read from page one to the end. I find that I'm increasingly not engaged with books I'm hoping to be. I tend to reread older books, 19th century books, Henry James, early 20th century books. I always go back to Dickens. I read Great Expectations at least once a year.
I often work on multiple pieces at a time, because I want to let things sit and look at them. Right now, I'm working on like what I call a non-body of work. It's like I'm not really sure what's going on at the moment, but through my process, I trust that I will find the body of work. So sometimes there's a little bit of a fumbling stage in order to get to the thing I need to discover. And I'm always looking at other artists, mostly in books. And when I can get to, when I travel, and like shows around here, but I spend a lot of time looking at books, pictures. Not as much online, but more like in collections or like looking for books and stuff like that. So, yeah. Thank you.
I think there was a question that came up about, what inspires you, what other writers inspire you, or what other artists inspire you. But what other forms of art, other than what you do, inspire you to do your work, like maybe music, something like that?
I often turn to music after the working day to kind of recharge. There was even a time when, in graduate school, when I would have music playing at a very low volume while I was working. I don't do that anymore. I find that too distracting. But the first thing I do when I finish working for the day is turn on Randy Newman or Paul Simon or who else? Aretha Franklin. I listen to a lot of R&B. I look at a lot of paintings. I go to a lot of galleries. I guess I would say if I had my preference as an artist, I would rather be a painter than a writer. And I would rather be a musician than anything. So.
I really like dance. I like to watch dance. When I go to New York, when we go to New York, we usually go see dance. And I think it's because I like to see the body in space moving. I've taken dance. I like to dance, freestyle dance. We don't dance enough, I think. And I also like stage theater plays because I like narratives. And I like music, but like Doug, I don't listen to music as much as I used to when I work because I like the quiet. But I love music. I mostly listen to music in the car nowadays and sometimes at home. So.
Thank you.
Sure. Is there a question over here? I want to ask about the intervention of art and words. I paint, but I'm a poet, and what I've been doing recently is deconstructing my own paintings, cutting them up, and putting them on other art paper, and then deconstructing poems on top of the deconstructed paintings. And something about that feels freer and unrestricted. And I wonder, Doug, if you have considered or experimented with deconstruction of your work and reassembling of your work in any way, because you have some amazing phraseology that you use, and I could sort of see it in pieces. So I'd like to ask you about that. And for Megan, I became fascinated with the artist Marina Abramovich and her piece where she sat. Yeah. And so when I saw the guy in the white, I thought of her.
He was heavily influenced by Abramovich, yeah.
Okay,
that's very astute observation.
And musically, I love the Ule O music. It's fabulous. Makes me want to write. So, Doug, can you talk about the... Sure. I certainly don't think of myself as combining forms, but I do think I think visually, and I try to have an almost cinematic quality to my narrative, with a lot of animation, a lot of movement, but I'm certainly a very visual writer in the sense that as I'm sitting there, I'm seeing it. So it's such a delight to hear you say you saw some stuff too. Thank you. But what I find myself doing more and more these days is turning to poetry and getting much more a kind of grounding, kind of I don't mean to sound too highfalutin, but there's kind of a feeling of an aesthetic grounding that I get from reading poems that I don't get so much reading prose these days. I wrote poetry when I was a very young man, and didn't read much poetry for a long time until graduate school, but over the last decade, I would say 70% of what I read these days is poetry.
What's my question? I'm sorry. Okay, me too. Deconstruction?
Yeah, deconstruction and collaboration with words.
Yeah, how to approach that?
Do you do
Words, well, lightly, I've touched on it, but it's not really a big component of my work. I did some work at Mills with this found graffiti I was seeing in these painting studios. I was photographing it and then printing the photographs on panels and painting over the graffiti to isolate particular words. But that's kind of as far as I did a little bit a long time ago in my undergraduate studies. I'm really fascinated. I love the painter Mel Bochner. Do you know who that is? I love his work. I love Ed Ruscha. I can maybe think of some others. I'm fascinated by text. That piece we did out at the Fire Lane was the closest I've gotten to text painting in a while. Yeah. Yeah.
Superimposing of the
Yeah.
installation over the words, and I've always thought of it the other way around.
Right. Well, so that's a different way to think about it. But it's interesting. It's a whole like discipline, text-based art, and there's so many examples that you could really dive into. We need to have a chat about this. Yeah. Are you here this week? Okay. We'll chat. I'm not an expert on text-based art, but I maybe could talk about it a little bit.
Seems like a good place to stop. Big hand again for Meg Hinton and Doug Bauer. So interesting. Remember Doug? Doug is going to be signing books at the back. And